This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. I'll own that I am a big kid. Even in my 40s, I find a giddy pleasure watching vinegar meet baking soda. There's something so cool about that foamy chemical reaction that a homemade volcano isn't necessary. But when you do have a papier-mâché dome and some food coloring, that eruption is definitely a lot more fun. And there's a reason kids love to play the floor is lava. Who isn't fascinated and awed by volcanoes, especially if it's closer than you think? Well, about 2.5 hours away from St. Louis, there's a place called Hicks Dome in Hardin County in southern Illinois. And here to talk with us about that nearby volcano and what kind of activity is and isn't going on there, we have Daniel Hummer, Associate Professor of Geology at Southern Illinois University. Daniel, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Now, would you call yourself a volcanologist?
No, not really. This is actually the first volcanic feature that I've worked on in my career. I would call myself more of a mineralogist.
Okay.
I study the formations of minerals.
Okay, so we're going to get back to that a little bit later. But the volcano that we are talking about, Hicks Dome in Hardin County, that is a dormant volcano. Is that correct?
Yes, it's very dormant, and in fact, we would consider it extinct. As best we know, there was only one period of activity, or a period of activity that lasted for a while and ended 270 million years ago. So,
Okay.
as best we know, looking at the geologic evidence, it has been dormant since that time. So we don't have to worry about any activity here in the modern day.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any idea as to how many extinct or dormant volcanoes there are in the continental U.S.?
Yeah, there's probably, I don't know an exact number, but there probably is on the order of dozens or maybe hundreds.
Mm-hmm.
Because throughout Earth's history, volcanic activity has been very common, but volcanoes tend to only last for as long as the geologic conditions permit. There has to be a source of hot magma under that location, and that generally will only happen, for a certain period of time. It could be millions or tens of millions of years, but eventually it dies down.
And you had said earlier that your interest is in mineralogy. Now, I am not a mineralogist. I'm also not a geologist by any measure. So for someone who does not have that kind of training or background, how can someone tell, or can they, that any given hill's got something more going on than being a pile of dirt?
Well, that's a great question. Even for us professional geologists, it can be tough to tell. And what you have to do, is dig below the surface. You have to dig below the surface soil and take a look at the rocks that are there. And once you start seeing the types of rocks that are there, then you start to get an idea of what the geologic history of that location is. In the instance of Hicks Dome, which is what we've been talking about today, when you do that digging, when you dig in and see what is under the surface in that hill, what you find are some very bizarre types of igneous rocks. Mm-hmm. Igneous being the type of rock, that forms from molten rock, forms from magma. And when we take a look at them, the compositions of these rocks are really unusual and have a lot of unusual constituents in them. And so that's how we know that there was some volcanic activity that is part of the history there.
Mm-hmm. And when we think of eruptions, ones that sort of spew all sorts of elements into the surrounding environment, I brought up the example of that elementary school sort of experiment. And from what I understand, there's no record of a geologic event at Hicks Dome, but there are some things that are known about it. You've mentioned some of the material, the radioactive material that's still there. Can you talk with us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of unusual materials that are part of the rocks there. As you mentioned, some of it is actually a little bit radioactive. and that is largely from the presence of the radioactive element thorium. And now that in and of itself is kind of unusual because usually when we don't find radioactive rocks all that often, as a matter of fact. So that even is unusual. But it's even more unusual that it's thorium because normally when we find radioactive rocks, it's radioactive because of uranium. That's by far the most common radioactive constituent in nature. Mm-hmm. So we usually find things like this and find that there's a lot of uranium. And there is a little bit of uranium, but there's actually even more thorium in these rocks. So that is strange. Where did all that thorium come from, and how did it get, pumped up towards the surface at Hicks Dome? Mm-hmm. That's one mystery. Another really interesting thing that we find there are the rare earth elements. And this is one, of course, that's becoming increasingly economically important because we use it for all of our modern technologies, smartphones and other electronics. Mm-hmm. We have to have these rare earth metals in order to build those things. And it's fairly unusual to find a location where enough rare earth metals have been concentrated in one place. But Hicks Dome may actually be one such location.
And how is Hicks Dome, how is it identified as a place where there is all of this rare earth mineral? I mean, was it a sort of serendipitous discovery, or were there some things kind of pointing in the direction of that dome?
Yeah, so it was first noticed, it first kind of got on scientists' radar, so to speak, all the way back, I believe, in the 50s or 60s maybe. And they had airplanes flying over, various parts of the country and taking magnetic readings. In other words, how strong is the Earth's magnetic field at a particular location. And what they noticed back in the 50s flying these planes over Hicks Dome is that there was a fairly extensive magnetic anomaly where there was more magnetic pull than there should be for just normal rock. Mm-hmm. And so that piqued everyone's interest. Well, then geologists started going in there and poking around to see what rocks they could find. And it took a while, but we eventually found little outcroppings of this very, very unusual igneous rock. And that was really what gave us the clue, that there could be an unusual deposit here.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about that pull, so it is instruments that were picking up on that?
Yes, so the planes had instruments on them called magnetometers that are able to read the strength of the magnetic field in the location where the plane is flying. And so that's what they use, and that's where we originally found out that this was a very unusual location.
So your own work then, when did your work over at Hicks Dome begin?
So my work on it began about 7 years ago or so when I first joined the faculty at SIU. And I learned about this location from other geologists there, and I thought, that's really interesting. I love to study how minerals form, and these are, some very unusual rocks and minerals that are in that location. Mm-hmm. So I decided to investigate it, and in fact, my very first graduate student, whose name is Kelly Wilson, and she now works for the Illinois State Geological Survey, did a project on it and was able to discover some things about the rare earth-bearing minerals that are at that location. And she actually found some new occurrences of rare earth minerals. So that's how it all started, and I've kind of been working on that location off and on since that time.
We're talking with Daniel Hummer, an associate professor of geology at Southern Illinois University. He's researching Hicks Dome, a dormant volcano in Southern Illinois. Now, you were talking about a former graduate student who did a project, and then you were able to identify some maybe new rare earth minerals. What are the ones that people would maybe not know so much about, but are really interesting in this area that you are doing your study on?
Yeah, so kind of the two most common minerals that we tend to extract rare earth from are called monazite and xenotime. They have kind of exotic-sounding names that have long histories behind them, but those are the two probably most common ones that we find in rare earth deposits. What my student found was an occurrence of xenotime in a location there at Hicks Dome where it had not been seen before. So that kind of added to our knowledge about how extensive the distribution of these rare earths is at Hicks Dome. And that's, of course, one of the things that we want to know. Another thing that we want to know is how much is there?
Mm-hmm.
Could this be a major deposit that drives, mining and technology here in the U.S. going into the future?
And would that be a good thing to start doing that kind of mining in the area you are?
Yes, it would definitely be a good thing. It would be great, for Illinois and for the United States as a whole. The problem that we've run into in recent years with the rare earth metals in particular is that China owns most of the supply, probably around 90% or so of the world's supply of rare earth metals is owned by China.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because they happen to have a couple of very large rare earth deposits in their country. So that makes sense. But they've also bought some rare earths from other places.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that leaves, major, developed nations like the United States somewhat lacking in rare earths, and we'd like to be able to find these resources for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is one location that can potentially help alleviate that problem.
So the research itself then, Daniel, can you talk about the process of research and maybe some of the tools that you are using and for what purpose?
Yeah, it's a very fun process. We use a lot of different tools. The process starts, of course, with field work. We actually go out there, myself and my graduate students and researchers from the Illinois State Geological Survey go out there and we collect rocks at places where we have found interesting things. We just continue looking around and mapping out where things are and collecting samples. And then we can take samples back to our lab, and we have a variety of techniques at our various laboratories that help us analyze what those rocks and minerals are made of. And from those characteristics, we can infer certain things about what must have taken place at Hicks Dome in order to get all of those unusual minerals there.
Mm-hmm. Insofar as the disciplines of the people who are part of the research team that you're working with now, is there anyone who is a contributor or a collaborator who has a different perspective from you, who adds another layer of understanding to what you're finding?
Oh, definitely. And this is something that, in science, you hardly ever work on something yourself because everybody has different skills and different perspectives to bring to the table. As for myself, my expertise tends to be in the crystallization of minerals. So I am working on that aspect of it, is how did those minerals actually get there and where did that material come from? What was the chemical process by which they formed?
Mm-hmm.
But you need other people as well. And I've been working with people like Brett Denny, like Yarrick Trella. These are just a few names, people at the Illinois State Geological Survey who are familiar with the stratigraphy, that is the layers of rocks, familiar with the geologic history at that area. And so, when you're all going out there together and collecting samples and looking around, you end up putting everybody's expertise together to learn new things. And it's sort of one of those situations where it's kind of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Mm-hmm.
And you can actually develop an understanding of what really happened there.
Yeah.
By having people with all these different perspectives. So it's a fun process for sure.
Now, would you say that Hicks Dome is well known among people living near the site, or is it mostly a place of interest for folks like you who are part of the scientific community?
I would say it's mostly a place of interest to the scientific community, and in particular the geological community. But certainly, people that are living near or on Hicks Dome, they're actually people that live on the dome. It's a gentle enough structure. It doesn't really look like a volcano. It kind of just looks like a very big, very wide hill. essentially. And there are people that that have their properties right on the dome. So I think that many of them are aware of what it is, but I don't think the public at large in the surrounding areas are really very aware that it's there. And that's interesting because it's very uncommon to have, one of these volcanic features. We actually call it a cryptovolcanic feature because it did not, and this is another thing that distinguishes Hicks Dome, it did not actually erupt lava onto the surface. It almost got to the surface. So the magma got really close to the surface. It sort of punched those topmost layers of rock upwards to form the dome. But all of the igneous material actually stayed underground. So that area had to get weathered down a little bit over these past 270 million years in order for us to even know that those rocks were down there.
Right. So, Daniel,
so I think that's why it's been kind of shrouded in mystery, and not a lot of people realize, that in fact, this volcanic feature is actually in their backyard.
Yeah. And have people shown interest? I mean, clearly, we have reached out to you to talk about it. Has there been an increase in the amount of interest or curiosity around Hicks Dome since, some news went out about it?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I've seen, the outreach work that I've done. I see a lot of comments on it. I think that people are becoming more aware. Of course, that's fun. It's nice to be able to not only do your science, but to also, express it to other people and get them excited about science and get them excited about, features and activities and research that's going on right under their noses. And all kinds of things like that are going on around you if you take a look. Oftentimes you drive by a highway and you see, some little weird piece of equipment or some little, pipe sticking out of somewhere. Well, that very may well be a scientist who's conducting an experiment or measurements there.
So science really is everywhere.
It is, yes. And scientists work everywhere, on all 7 continents and in the ocean and, all kinds of places.
So then the last question, because if we're talking about volcanoes, I think people will want to know, is there any chance Hicks Dome will blow?
Fortunately, no. There's no chance that will happen because the reason that it was able to do so 270 million years ago is that there was actually rifting. There was, part of the crust was being pulled apart and was kind of, breaking here in this area in the middle of the North American continent. And so because of that, hot material from below was able to squeeze up into cracks, and shoot upwards. Well, we know from geological, mapping and studies that's not happening today. The middle of North America is very, very stable. And where we're going to see a lot of geologic activity like volcanoes and earthquakes and mountain building nowadays is going to be on the edges of the modern-day continent. So fortunately, no, we don't have to worry about erupting it today. But the fact that it did this so long ago in the past and that we can see the remnants of it and that we may even be able to take advantage of the metals that are there, to help our entire country's economy, I think, that speaks to the power of the geosciences and everything that scientists do.
Well, thank you so much for giving us some insight into this. We'll have to rely on travel and our little baking soda and vinegar experiments for now. Daniel Hummer is Associate Professor of Geology at Southern Illinois University. Daniel, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks very much to you. It's been a pleasure.
Today's segment was produced by Aula Kuziz,
with audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.